Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Marathon, originally for Macintosh but later ported to other systems. This is a first-person shooter by Bungie software that was released in 1994 for Macintosh, and it later saw release on PC and Linux as the Aleph-1 source port, which is the same game, it's just in the open source version of the engine. And this is an official freeware release. I will have a link in the video description box where you can pick this up. But suffice to say, it's a fairly interesting game purely from the fact that it's a first-person shooter for Macintosh, let alone the precursor to the Halo series. So that begs the question right there. How is this thing compared to, of course, its peers on PC, as well as just being a Mac first-person shooter where we don't really have all that much in the way of Mac-exclusive games, even back in the 90s. But more importantly, does it stand the test of time? Well, as far as the presentation goes, it certainly looks pretty good for its time. I mean, it's a 2.5D game. You do have a sort of 3D environment, but 2D sprite work and everything to go along with it, much in the way of every first-person game at that time, really. So it's pretty comparable to Doom in that regard, although I would say that the sprite work is a fair bit more detailed than Doom's. To be fair, it did release a year afterward, and it actually released the same year as Doom 2, so it's worth keeping that in mind as we go through the rest of this review. But suffice to say, the game still holds up pretty well, actually. The visuals have aged very well for the most part. One thing I don't like, however, is that the visuals tend to be very, very dark. The lighting in this game tends to err on the side of being ridiculously dark, so you actually can't really see what you're doing half the time unless you really up the brightness pretty significantly. And that makes the game look kind of awful. So I try not to do that and just muddle through it anyway. It ends up being a bit of a mess in that regard. That said, it does also suffer from the same issues that most early first-person shooters did, which is to say that animations are fairly bare bones. They're pretty minimal in terms of frames, and in this one in particular, they're only about 2 frames of animation for example, reloads, and it just doesn't look very good in a lot of ways. It's nice that they actually have reloads, and that's something that's pretty weird for the early 90s, but at the same time, the animations themselves just aren't all that well detailed. And then there's the sound design, which is flat out wimpy. When the ricochet noises are beefier than the actual firing sounds of the weapons you're using, then you know you've got a problem. And the sound effects in this game just really don't inspire all that much confidence. When I'm firing this pistol, which it explicitly states is a .44 Magnum, you'd think that thing would sound pretty powerful, but it just sounds like a normal, wimpy, low-caliber pistol. And then when you get to things like the assault rifle, it doesn't sound particularly beefy either. It just sounds like they took a generic assault rifle sound effect and used that. And that sort of problem plagues the music as well. It's just bland and uninteresting. They tried to go for this sort of sci-fi, ominous and atmospheric vibe, but it ends up just falling flat on its face. And on occasion, it ends up just being, frankly, kind of annoying. So they kind of failed miserably on the sound design aspects, but they did pretty well on the visuals for the time. But obviously what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is that you are a security officer aboard the UESC Marathon, which is a ship that is now in the Tau Ceti system and is trying to help with colonization of a planet, Tau Ceti 4, and aliens attack. So now you have to deal with this alien invasion, and you're doing so with the help of one of the ship's 3 AIs, specifically Leela, who at the start of the game is the only one that's considered fully functional, and then later on you find out that one of the other AIs, Durandal, has gone rampant, which is a state in which the AI has basically become fully self-aware and is kind of going crazy. Not quite crazy, but something equivalent to crazy for an AI. And so it goes from there. You're still fighting all the aliens as you go through, and you eventually find out that they are named the Pfor and the I can't even try to pronounce this crap. I'm just gonna display it on the screen. Look at these names. They're stupid. Okay? They're just straight up stupid names. I don't know how to pronounce them. The game doesn't pronounce them for you. So it's just basically like, okay, screw it. We're just gonna name them something that's practically unpronounceable. That said, the plot in the game is fairly minimal and is mostly told through these terminals that you come across that give you some backstory into what exactly the ship is. They tell you things like what aliens you're fighting, all sorts of things like that, and of course Leela is talking to you this entire time through these terminals to give you ideas on how to progress through the missions. So that leads into the gameplay, because honestly, while the story is not particularly bad, it's not particularly good either. It's just kinda there. It's more than most first-person shooters of the time, let's give it that, but that's not saying much. And really, it ultimately just becomes you don't care as you're constantly trying to fight the aliens and the rest of the game. See, this was a first-person shooter that released in 1994. It plays a lot like Doom in a lot of ways, and that stands to reason. Most FPSs up until the really more late 90s were called Doom clones, and for very good reason. They generally played a lot like Doom. And here's the thing. They did try to differentiate this from games like Doom, from other Doom clones out there, as they were known at the time, in a variety of ways, the first of which being what I already mentioned, the story, because most Doom clones and most FPSs up until really the late 90s didn't really have much in the way of plot. So that right there differentiates it from the majority, but they also took it a few steps further. For example, this thing has free look. Now, Doom had mouse controls if you wanted to go that route. I never did, because I just got used to the keyboard controls. But if you wanted to, you could use the mouse, but it was only on a horizontal plane. In Marathon, they allowed you to use it on a vertical plane, which is something that was very, very new at the time. And they do throw in quite a few enemies that are on higher or lower planes than what you are at, so you do actually need to make use of this feature, and it may be helpful to enable the crosshair if you do decide to play this thing. The next thing that they added that makes it pretty wildly different from most FPSs up until really the 2000s, and that this is the first first-person shooter to ever have dual wielding. So you can actually pick up another Magnum and run around with dual pistols if you want. In fact, the pistol is a generally good all-around weapon compared to things like the MA-75 assault rifle, which has a ridiculous spread to where you can be at literal point blank, basically shoving the thing down an enemy's throat, and you can actually miss. Believe it or not, because it will actually spread bullets that far. It's pretty ridiculous. It's also one of the first games to have secondary fires on weapons. For example, the MA-75 can fire the underslung grenade launcher. So that's actually a pretty cool feature to have. And it certainly has this kind of forward-thinking mentality in some respects. And especially considering that while most games of this era were still the find a key or key card, find the exit kind of formulas, this one doesn't really do that. It's more you need to complete an objective, which is usually just either find an object and then use something, usually a terminal or a switch, or just go flip a few switches and you're done. Now go find the teleport out of here. But even then, that is still more varied than the objectives of most FPSs for the time. So you may be looking at that feature list and go, ooh, well this actually sounds pretty good. And then you actually play it. And you find very, very quickly that it's good ideas that were very poorly implemented. You see, weapons don't handle particularly well. I already mentioned the MA-75 has an absolutely ridiculous spread to it, and that's just downright irritating to deal with. But other than that, you're having to deal with generally low damage all around. If you go up and try to punch things, it better be the green aliens that you come across first, because trying to punch even the guys who are one step above that, the same type of alien but in red armor, is an exercise in futility, really. You're going to be spending an awfully long time trying to punch them to death. And weapons have reloads that you need to keep in mind. For example, the pistols reload after 8 shots, and the MA-75 runs out of ammo incredibly quickly and has to reload. So what you end up having is these situations where you'll just be rocking the full auto on, for example, the MA-75 assault rifle, and you'll find that you'll run out of ammo incredibly quickly, and there's still enemies coming at you, still throwing projectiles at you, and it becomes pretty nasty to deal with that, particularly due to what I think is actually the thing that kills this game, which is the level design. Rather than simply tell you about it, I've been showing you this throughout the entirety of this review, but now I'm going to actually show you the top-down view of one of the levels, and you will see immediately what the problem is. The level design in this game is downright horrible. Paths twist in and around themselves to the point where it's so incredibly easy to get turned around or just go in circles because you see an identical looking corridor and you're like, well, maybe I haven't gone down here, and then you go down there and you're like, oh, I was just here. Wait a minute, this goes around in a loop. What the hell's going on? This is the entirety of Marathon. You are 100% guaranteed to get turned around and lost in these levels. This takes Labyrinthine and just runs with it. You see, if you compare it to other FPSs of the era, for example, Doom. Doom may have had fairly labyrinthine levels, but they actually followed a pretty obvious structure. You could very easily tell where you needed to go. It was very rare to actually get lost in Doom, and it was only on a couple of levels. In Marathon, it's almost every single damn level. And even worse than that is that they throw in things like needing to find secret doors and such to be able to progress. For example, there's a section in the earliest parts of the game, in fact it's level 3, where you actually need to find a secret door to be able to progress past the opening area. Because what ends up happening is that you go into this corridor and you find a button on the wall. You press the button on the wall, it opens the door in front of you. You step into this room, door shuts behind you if you don't go back out of it in time, and the platform starts rising very, very, very slowly. So you're looking for a door. There isn't one, at least not that you can see. So what you end up having to do is just run along the walls and just spam the action button until finally the secret door opens and you're like, really guys? You went this route? You need to have something denoting that there is a door there that you actually need to use to progress. You do not hide a secret door like that as part of your main progression of your level. It is a terrible idea. And once again, this sort of thing happens all the time. It's not just secret doors. It is incredibly easy to get yourself stuck in an area if you didn't press the right switch at the right time, and you're just going through this area with these horribly labyrinthine levels and where they circle in and around themselves, and you come across something where you were supposed to press a button in some other part of the map that you haven't even been to yet, and so you fall into a pit and get stuck. So then you have to go to load a save game, but then you realize that the save system in this game is not like really any other FPS of the early 90s, in that you can't save anywhere. Oh no, you have to find save points. Yes, you heard me right. This game has save points that you have to find. And it doesn't autosave at the beginning of a level. So what ends up happening is that you might go into a new level and get yourself killed. And that's fairly likely considering that this game loves to do things really nastily to you, like throw you into an extremely narrow corridor. I mean, the entire game is basically nothing but really narrow corridors, so that's not saying much. But throwing you into a really narrow corridor that suddenly gets filled with tons of aliens both in front of you and behind you, all of which are attacking you at the same time. And if you happen to have fairly low health from the previous level for some reason, well, guess what? You're screwed. And there's no possible way you could have known that this was going to happen unless you had seen a walkthrough, or you had seen video footage of it before, or you just play through the level before. And the even better part is that there is a terminal right next to you, that if you try to activate it, then it will tell you, oh, by the way, aliens are in this sector, watch out, while they're attacking you. Because when you're accessing those terminals, guess what? Aliens can still attack you, and they can still hit you and do damage. Oh, and there's no healing items either. You have to find points scattered throughout the levels where you recharge your health. Sort of like the recharge stations in the Half-Life games, only this is the only way you can recover your health. Technically, it's considered a shield generator, but that's beside the point. Now, I'm sure some of you at this point are probably going, well, DW, obviously you just suck at the game, and that's why you're complaining about it. No, the level design is downright horrible. If I can play through Doom on the Ultra Violence difficulty setting without dying once, then I shouldn't have any trouble with friggin' Marathon on normal difficulty. Yet I do. And it's both from this absolutely atrocious level design and from the floaty, awkward movement. It's actually pretty hard to describe how the movement feels in this game, because it's floaty, but at the same time, you feel like you're moving through molasses. So you're basically just gliding through the levels, but at the same time, you don't feel like you have any real precision or speed over the movement. It's just this kind of really awkward pace that just doesn't feel right. It's kind of hard to describe. Like I said, it's one of those things you just kind of have to feel for yourself to really understand. But I couldn't tell you how many times I have fallen off of platforms or fallen into pits or things simply because I couldn't adjust to the movement properly. It just feels wrong at every single turn. Even the mouse look just doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel smooth. It feels kind of janky. And I guess that's because it's an older game that was trying to do the whole vertical space with free look thing, but even then it just feels off and just gives you this impression like you don't really have all that much precision. Now, there is one other thing that is to note about this game which I haven't partaken in, which is the multiplayer. I do know that Marathon had a fairly dedicated multiplayer community, most of which is now playing Marathon Infinity if they're playing Marathon at all, and that's the thing. It was kind of a big deal for this particular game to have network multiplayer back in the day, but with mechanics this janky, I cannot remotely see how that would be enjoyable. And that's ultimately the problem I have with Marathon. It is interesting from a historical standpoint. In fact, it's extremely interesting from a historical standpoint. This was one of Bungie's first big games. This was one of their first big successes. And it was on a system that isn't really associated with gaming all that much, the Macintosh. It did pretty well for itself there. And it introduced features that by now are practically standard. But at the same time, there's a reason that PC gamers were not impressed by it other than its technical side of things. And that is because it plays really poorly. The weapons feel off, the movement feels wrong, the levels are downright horrible, and the story isn't really enough to save that, nor are these extra features that they threw in. So ultimately, I cannot recommend Marathon from a gamer's perspective. It is not an enjoyable game in the slightest. You're constantly getting lost and confused, you're constantly finding that the controls just feel off, like you don't have any real precision to your movement, you're constantly feeling like your aiming isn't as precise as it should be. It just feels like a complete mess of a game, and again, the level design is just horrible. I cannot get over that. But I can recommend it from a purely historical standpoint, where you're just looking at gaming history and want to know of the game that introduced things like dual wielding. and one of the earliest games to have swimming in it, at least in first-person shooters, I should say. But other than that, if you're looking for a good classic first-person shooter, this isn't it. This game came out the exact same year as System Shock and Doom 2. That should tell you something. Play those. Don't play this. Thanks for watching.